this episode, we're going to take a part of security that sounds administrative at first and show why it is one of the highest impact areas for preventing real incidents, running the account lifecycle cleanly from start to finish. Most beginners think about security as stopping hackers, but a large share of real-world breaches succeed because accounts are created carelessly, permissions accumulate quietly, and accounts are not removed when people leave or change roles. An account is a living thing in a system. Because it is created, it gains access, it changes over time, it is used in different ways, and eventually it should be retired. If that life cycle is managed well, access becomes predictable and risks become contained. If it is managed poorly, the environment slowly fills with unnecessary access, abandoned accounts, and permission drift that attackers love. We will build a clear understanding of provisioning, deprovisioning, access reviews, and drift control so you can reason about why these processes matter and what good looks like. A clean life cycle starts with understanding what an account actually represents, because an account is not just a username. It is a package of identity and authority. Identity is the claim that this account belongs to a specific person or system, and authority is what that account is allowed to do. If either part is wrong, the system's security decisions become unreliable. When you provision an account, you are effectively creating a doorway into your environment, and that doorway must be tied to the right person, granted the right access, and monitored for appropriate use. This is why lifecycle management is inseparable from access control, because access control models and authentication mechanisms do not help if the wrong accounts exist or if accounts have more access than intended. Beginners often focus on how secure the login method is, but the deeper question is whether the account should exist at all and, if it should, what it should be able to do. Lifecycle discipline answers those questions in a repeatable way. Provisioning is the process of creating an account and granting it initial access, and it is one of the most common points where organizations accidentally create long-term risk. A good provisioning process begins with identity proofing, which means ensuring that the person requesting access is who they claim to be and that the request is legitimate. In a work environment, this often includes confirming the person's employment status, role, and start date, along with confirming what resources they actually need. The risk in sloppy provisioning is that access gets granted based on assumptions, urgency, or informal requests, and those early permissions tend to stick forever. Another risk is creating duplicate accounts, which can happen when a person is on board twice or when a contractor returns and receives a new identity instead of reactivating the original carefully. Duplicate identities make auditing and accountability harder. When provisioning is clean, every account has a clear owner, a clear purpose, and a clear baseline of access that matches that purpose. An important beginner concept is that access should be granted based on role and need, not based on convenience or broad templates that give everyone more than necessary. This is where role design and least privilege should guide provisioning decisions, because the easiest time to keep access small is at the beginning. When you start an account with minimal permissions and add more only when needed, you reduce risk and you make later reviews simpler. When you start an account with broad permissions to avoid delays, you create hidden overreach that is easy to forget. The reason overreach is dangerous is that it expands what an attacker can do if the account is compromised, and it increases the chance of accidental misuse by the legitimate user. Clean provisioning is also about consistency, because consistent permissions are easier to review and easier to troubleshoot. If two people with the same job have wildly different access, that inconsistency is a signal that the lifecycle process is not being applied uniformly. Many organizations describe the life cycle with the joiner, mover, leaver idea, and even if you have never heard that phrase before, the concept is intuitive. A joiner is someone new who needs an account. A mover is someone whose role changes and therefore needs a permission change, and a leaver is someone who should have access removed. The mover case is where drift often begins because role changes happen frequently, and organizations often add new permissions without removing old ones. This creates a slow accumulation of access that may no longer be justified. For example, someone might move from a support role to a management role, and instead of switching to the new role permissions cleanly, they retain the old privileges plus the new ones. Over time, this can create accounts that have far more authority than any single role should have. Clean lifecycle management treats moves as a reset opportunity, where access is reevaluated and aligned to the new job function rather than endlessly accumulated. Deprovisioning is the process of removing access when it is no longer needed, and it is one of the most urgent lifecycle actions because delays create immediate exposure. When a person leaves an organization, their access should be removed quickly because a lingering account can be abused by the former employee, by someone who gains access to their credentials, or by an attacker who discovers the account exists. Deprovisioning is also critical when an account is suspected of compromise because removing access limits damage. A common beginner misconception is that disabling a login is enough, but you also need to consider active sessions, tokens, and connected systems where access might persist. Another misconception is that only human accounts matter, but service accounts and system integrations can also become orphaned and abused. Clean deprovisioning is comprehensive, meaning you disable or remove access across the environment. You terminate active access paths, and you confirm the account can no longer be used. If deprovisioning is inconsistent, attackers can find the weakest leftover path. Dormant accounts are a special risk category because they sit quietly, often unnoticed, and they can become a perfect entry point for attackers. An account might become dormant because someone changed jobs, stopped using a system, or left a project, but the account was never cleaned up. Dormant accounts are dangerous because they may have permissions that were appropriate once but are no longer reviewed, and they may also have weaker security because nobody is actively using them and noticing unusual activity. Attackers also prefer accounts that are unlikely to trigger suspicion, and a dormant account can fit that pattern because it is not generating normal usage patterns. A clean lifecycle includes policies for disabling accounts after a period of inactivity and re-verifying identity and need before reactivation. This is not about punishing users. It is about recognizing that unused access is pure risk with no benefit. When you reduce dormant accounts, you reduce the number of silent doors an attacker can try. Access reviews are the mechanism that prevents lifecycle drift from silently becoming the norm, and they are one of the most important habits in sustainable security. A review means someone validates that a user still needs the access they have, that their role is still correct, and that unusual permissions are justified. Reviews matter because reality changes faster than documentation, and permissions often change through informal pathways, emergencies, or gradual accumulation. Without reviews, permissions become historical artifacts rather than current needs. The best way to think about reviews is as a correction loop, because they catch mistakes, they catch oversights, and they catch drift before drift becomes a breach. Reviews also reinforce accountability, because an owner must sign off that access is appropriate. For beginners, it is important to see that reviews are not only about removing access. They are about ensuring access aligns with work, which supports both security and operational clarity. Drift control is the broader discipline of preventing and correcting the gradual mismatch between intended access and actual access over time. Drift can happen for many reasons, like emergency access granted and never removed, role changes handled by adding rather than switching, exceptions treated as permanent, or manual changes made without consistent tracking. Drift is dangerous because it is slow, and slow problems are easy to ignore, especially when nothing breaks immediately. Attackers, however, benefit from slow problems because drift creates over-permissioned accounts that can be used to expand access quietly. Drift control requires both process and monitoring. The process piece includes structured approvals, consistent role definitions, and scheduled reviews. The monitoring piece includes visibility into permission changes, detection of unusual access patterns, and alerts when accounts gain high-risk privileges. Drift control is essentially maintenance for identity and access, and like all maintenance, it prevents expensive failures later. A clean lifecycle also requires careful handling of privileged accounts, because privilege adds risk and should not be treated as a default state. When someone needs administrative capabilities, it is safer to separate that capability from their everyday account identity, so routine activity does not occur with elevated power. Even without discussing specific tools, the principle is that privileged access should be deliberate, time-bounded when possible, and subject to stronger oversight. Privileged access should also be reviewed more frequently because the impact of misuse is higher. Another important point is that privilege permissions should not be granted through informal channels, because informality makes tracking and review difficult. When privileged access is granted cleanly, there is a record of why it was granted, who approved it, and when it should be removed or reevaluated. This helps with accountability and helps with incident response because you can quickly identify which accounts could have performed a high-impact action. Service accounts deserve their own attention because they often live longer than human accounts and are frequently over-permissioned for convenience. A service account is typically used by an application, process, or integration to authenticate and access resources, and because it is not a human, it does not change jobs or leave the company in a clean way. That can make service accounts persist indefinitely, accumulating permissions and becoming forgotten. Forgotten service accounts are dangerous because they can be compromised without obvious human signs, and they may have access to valuable data or administrative functions. A clean lifecycle treats service accounts like first-class identities with owners, defined purposes, scope permissions, and periodic reviews. It also includes retirement plans, because when an application is decommissioned, its service accounts should be removed promptly. If you leave service accounts behind, you leave hidden access pathways behind. Beginners should remember that attackers do not care whether an account is human or not. They care about what it can do. Lifecycle quality also depends on clear governance, because someone must define what good provisioning and deprovisioning look like, and someone must have authority to enforce those rules. Governance sets requirements, such as how quickly accounts must be disabled after termination, how access requests must be approved, and how often access reviews must occur. It also defines ownership, meaning who is responsible for performing reviews, who approves exceptions, and who validates compliance. Without that structure, lifecycle tasks become optional, and optional security tasks are often skipped when workloads rise. A strong lifecycle program also supports the organization by making access predictable. When people know how to request access and how long it takes, they are less likely to seek workarounds. When managers know they are responsible for confirming access needs, they pay more attention to role alignment. Governance turns lifecycle management into a normal operational function rather than an occasional cleanup project. When you see lifecycle scenarios in exam questions, they often focus on what went wrong rather than naming the lifecycle concept directly, so it helps to recognize typical failure patterns. If the scenario involves a former employee still having access, the core problem is weak deprovisioning or delayed account disabling. If the scenario involves users accumulating permissions after job changes, the core problem is drift caused by poor mover handling and weak reviews. If the scenario involves unknown accounts or shared credentials, the core problem is poor identity ownership and weak accountability, which undermines auditing. If the scenario involves a service account with broad access that nobody remembers, the core problem is missing lifecycle ownership for non-human identities. The best corrective actions in these scenarios usually involve tightening provisioning controls, enforcing timely deprovisioning, implementing regular access reviews, and improving visibility into permission changes. When you can match symptoms to lifecycle breakdowns, you can choose the most effective control instead of being distracted by unrelated security measures. By the end of this episode, the main point should feel solid and practical. Account lifecycle management is a core security control because it governs the identities that every other control depends on. Clean provisioning ensures accounts are tied to real identities and granted only needed access. Clean deprovisioning removes access quickly when it is no longer justified, closing doors that attackers love to find open. Regular reviews and drift control keep access aligned with reality as roles and systems change, preventing slow accumulation of unnecessary privilege. Thoughtful handling of privileged accounts and service accounts prevents hidden high-impact pathways from persisting unnoticed. When lifecycle management is disciplined, you reduce the number of accounts that should not exist, reduce the power of accounts that do exist, and increase your confidence that access matches intent. That combination is one of the most reliable ways to make security stronger without relying on any single perfect technology, because it strengthens the identity foundation that every environment must stand on.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.